Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract. I'm so excited today in the house. Andrew Barnes is here. Let me explain who Andrew is, and we're going to get right into some, shall we say, 4-day thinking, perhaps, Andrew. So, Mr. Barnes, you've made a career of market-changing innovation and industry digitization. He owns and is director of Coulthard Barnes, Perpetual Guardian, and New Zealand's largest crowdfunding website, Give a Little. Or shall I say give a lot? That seems like your DNA, my friend. He's best known as co-founder, however, of 4-Day Week Global, the international not-for-profit which advocates for and supports organizations with their journey to a shorter, productivity-focused work week. I shall call you the new Henry Ford, but we'll get into that. The 180-100 trademark model has earned worldwide acclaim, with the organization being named a Time 100 Most Influential Company for 2023. In the last 5 years, Andrew has worked with countless companies and provided advice to over a dozen national and regional governments on how their populations will work in the future. I guess that's if we have a future, Andrew. He also has recently recognized as the Forbes Future of Work 50 list as a leader in workplace innovation. His most recent achievement in June 2024 has been the recognition and award of an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for outstanding achievement and support in the community. That is a humdinger. Earlier in his career, Andrew held positions including chairman of realestate.com.au, CEO of UK-based investment management and advisory company Best Invest, and the managing director of Australian Wealth Management Limited. In 2019, which is where we're going to pick up the story, Andrew, he wrote the 4-Day Week book as a guide for companies trying to reduce work hours and increase productivity. Now, we're going to get into this because I wrote a book in the years 2018, 2019, and just going into the beginning of 2020, which I then released in 2020 called Lead, Care, Win. In it, I was looking at these 9 leadership behaviors. One of the 9 is called Commit to Balance. Inside of Commit to Balance was you and Perpetual Guardian. What I had glommed onto in 2018, 2019 was this little thing that you had piloted. And I was thinking to myself, good God, why aren't more people doing this? Because if we're going to commit to balance, we think about the whole human being. That's why I think you're the new Henry Ford. So tell me, first of all, a bit about what you were up to in Perpetual Guardian back in 2018, and then segueing into the 4-Day Week itself.
Well, Daniel, look, I always feel a little bit of a fraud when I listen to something like that, because actually I was binge reading Economist magazines back in 2017 on a long haul flight, and there was a series of reports on productivity in the workplace, and productivity was deemed in these reports to be about 2.5 hours a day. And I thought, is that happening in my company? So I wondered what would happen if we went back to the team and said, right, what would you do differently? If I gave you a day off on full pay, what would you do differently so that you could deliver the same amount of output in 4 days rather than 5? So it was a real exercise in saying, how do I improve productivity in the company? The work-life balance bit, I'd like to say, wasn't quietly front and center at that point in time, but there was, I thought, a recognition that often lack of time meant that people brought other activities, care duties, trying to sort out home security, home services, all of those sort of things. You were having to do that from your workplace rather than doing it in your own time. So part of the thesis was, if I give you more time to do those personal things, you're not going to get the same distractions at work. And that was also prompted by a great piece of research that said if you were continually interrupted at work, it was the equivalent of operating under the influence of marijuana.
Wow.
Yeah, and statistically at work, people are interrupted once every 11 minutes. So a bit of this was around, if we rethought work, if we rethought not just the environment that you're at work, but work itself, why do we have 9 to 5, 5 days a week? Well, as you alluded to, Henry Ford, we think, really generated that. But if in the information age, we have to ask the question, why is it that work is the one thing that hasn't changed for 100 years? How we work. Everything else in our world has changed. So what that led to was the trial in Perpetual Guardian. We did it for 3 months. And the research that we did alongside that just blew me away. Because what that showed was not only did productivity go up, but engagement scores, empowerment, enrichment, enthusiasm went off the scale. And we also had people, sick days halved, recruitment time dropped, we didn't have as much staff turnover. Everything improved because we reduced the amount of time we asked people to work. Now, looking back, we'll go, well, that's simple, isn't it? Healthier, happier, more engaged, more rested staff and more productive. Well, who'd have thought? But we didn't really think that at the time.
So being ahead of your time then, however, with Perpetual Guardian and the team members there, and as I looked into it, like team members were flowing with praise on this new integrated way of work and life in this 4-day work week pilot that you had. But very soon after, what made larger headlines, and this is before the pandemic really shook us in March of 2020, was the Microsoft Japan trial in 2019. And so how did you feel about that in a grander scale? Because Microsoft Japan were suggesting, they had a 40% increase in productivity. Similarly, their engagement scores went up. They found their client sat went up. There's a bunch of good things that happened right after your pilot and trial. So tell me a bit about how you felt, and then we're going to get into sort of the next era, which was the pandemic era.
Well, obviously it was vindication in a way. I mean, we were a very small business, the bottom of the world, 300 people. We'd announced it. We'd got global headlines. I mean, we stopped counting. I think we stopped counting at the point of when we announced that we were doing it, the results of the trial, and when we made it permanent. On each occasion, we stopped counting when we got to double-digit thousands of articles globally. It was extraordinary. I don't think I've ever experienced anything like it. But what that said was that actually, when you looked at the feedback that was coming globally, that actually people were saying that actually the way we work today isn't fit for purpose. That message was loud and clear. Mm-hmm. The problem is that leaders like ourselves, we're not incented to take that sort of risk, which is to question the basics. Now, Microsoft, interestingly, did the trial because it coincided with the Tokyo Olympics.
Yeah.
And there was a problem, they thought, in terms of the amount of people in Tokyo. So the way they were going to deal with reducing the strain on the transport network was to get people to work less. So it had nothing to do with work-life balance. And actually, in that case, everything to do with trying to make it easier for people to get to the Olympics, both visitors and locals. But the result came out the same. So it wasn't, their focus was different from my focus, but just by giving people more time, you got all this benefit. Mm-hmm. Now, that for me was the interesting link, because that was the point at which you say, well, if we properly rethink this, then perhaps those benefits can be made to last. So Microsoft only did it for the period of the Olympics. We've been doing it ever since 2018 now. So we've got some good long data on this. But, that is always the suspicion of people when they look at it. This is a short-term burst. It creates short-term benefit, and then it will revert to the normal.
Which takes us to 2020. So you've got 2018 and the goodness of you and the team at Perpetual Guardian. You've got the Microsoft trial and sort of in anticipation of the Tokyo Olympics. And then you've got, insert eerie, scary, evil Darth Vader music, the pandemic that hits. And, the old Friday the 13th of March in 2020, where literally the world shut down and your fine country literally shut itself down from anyone else. Good job on you, by the way. So tell me a bit about what it was like for you in 2020 with perspective of, okay, well, there's a 4-day week or 4-day work week, I should say. But now we've got sort of a whole other layer, which is people working from home.
Yeah.
And now how are you rationalizing with yourself the 4-day work week in this context? And are you rethinking things for purposes of, well, what's the next future of work look like with respect to your model?
Well, the problem with working from home, and I think this is one of the things that came out, is that you're not working from home, you're sleeping in the office. So the net result of that is that, yes, we saw an improvement in some cases of productivity when people working from home because they can deal with the sort of the work-life balance aspect. But there is a massive temptation to sit down late at night and do that task that you haven't done earlier. So, in fact, there is quite some evidence that working days actually expanded. They didn't necessarily shrink as a consequence of working from home. The other thing is there is clear evidence that in a lot of cases, and there's been some recent research on this now, that often people are doing work with children in the room and things going on. Now, each one time that happens, that comes back to my interruption point. If you are interrupted and you lose your train of thought, it takes you 22 minutes to get back to fully engaged. So if that happens all the time, notwithstanding that you are, working from home or whatever, if that happens, then you're still not being efficient. So what the pandemic actually did is it opened the eyes of business leaders around the world that you didn't necessarily need to have staff in the office because some people were just as productive out. Mm-hmm. The second thing was you had to find a different way of measuring productivity. Because one of the first questions, whenever we talk to business leaders around the world, the first question they ask when we talk about, reducing the working week, creating more focus on output, the first thing they say is, well, how do you measure productivity? And if you think about it, what they're actually saying is we don't measure productivity. We use time as a surrogate for productivity. And therefore, if I change the 9 to 5, by definition, if I drop it by 20%, my productivity goes down 20%. Now, that assumes that every minute, every hour of every day is productive. And the evidence that got me on the journey was it wasn't. So if you can eliminate, some would say something like 80% of the day that is not necessarily productive, but certainly 60%. If you can eliminate that or reduce that, then actually dropping the working week by 20%, if you then eliminate wastage in each of the other 4 days, means that output goes up. It's quite simple. Now, the pandemic put, I think, rocket fuel under that because people had to suddenly question the model. And so you see still to this day empty office blocks the length and breadth of the land because nobody's going back in. And then also they had to find a way to measure the output. So that has changed. And that, I think, more than anything, is why when we sit now, what was a mad idea in 2018 is now mainstream leadership thinking, even if it is mainstream yet in terms of practice.
So we hang out in the Thinkers 50 community, and I didn't ask you this last time, but I'll ask you this now publicly. Do you think that your prescient thinking with the model, and I want you to get into the 100, 80, 100, by the way, but do you think that the prescience was actually, this is a focus and efficiency backdoor subliminal modeling, meaning what it does is it actually gets people tuned into and queued up with their focus and their ability to be attentive, rather than allowing a lot of those encumbrances and the distractions and the interruptions, as you rightly point out, affecting their performance.
Yes, I think shortly, that's the short answer is yes. I think the question is, why does it work?
Yeah.
Now, I think what we found, so we did in the US trial and South African trial, and I think the last UK trial, we asked the question of people when they, at the end of the pilot programs, we said, how much would you need to be paid to go back to working 5 days a week? And about 15% said, frankly, you can't. You just can't pay me enough. Yeah. About another 15% said, yes, I don't know, 75% more. The most would sit there and say broadly something from at least 25% more to 75% more. Frankly, you're going to have to pay me that. So what that says is that an individual values time off at a higher price than you're prepared to pay for it.
Right.
And therefore, as a consequence, they are changing behavior. Now, some of that is structure. We have a quiet hour in our organization. So 1 hour a day when you can put a flag in a pot and no one will disrupt you. If you eliminate those one interruption every 11 minutes, you get about 3 hours of productivity out of a single hour. So you've actually made up that day that you've lost just probably from that one initiative alone. There's lots of other things that you can do. But the whole point about this is that people change their behaviors. They stop taking personal phone calls. They, focus on the task in hand. They do their personal admin outside. They're more rested. They're healthier. They're not taking as many sick days. So all of this changes the dynamic because you've given them something that they want. Now, that's what powers the 4-day week. And that's what drives the change. All too often as leaders, we go, you know what, let's bring in McKinsey. I do a process of re-engineering.
Here we go.
They're going to change this. We're going to change that. And all the employee hears is job losses.
Yeah.
You want me to do more with less. And actually, guess what? There's nothing in it for me. This is bottom-up re-engineering, where you go to the employees and say, well, this is our philosophy. You've got to take it seriously, but fundamentally, what are you going to do differently? And that means that what do you do to change your behavior? And also, how do you interact with your colleagues? You then stop wasting their time as well. Because if they don't succeed, you don't succeed. And the whole organization can't sustain a 4-day week. So for me, it changes culture by empowering your people to rethink their part in the work.
It's such an empowering move as well. Like, again, back to the subliminal comment, you are creating a culture change through leadership by empowering people to basically get better control of their time. And I know you and I have talked about similar adage, which is you don't manage time, it's an investment. And so I want you to help people hear and see your 100, 80, 100 category definitions, because to me, it's so simple, yet it actually empowers the employee to see, right, that, hey, we're behind you. Don't worry. Here's the numbers, and it's not do more with less, by the way.
Yeah. So the whole concept behind 100, 80, 100, it's to try and explain that because the 4-day week is a little bit of a misnomer, right? 100, 80, 100 is 100% 5-day pay, 80% 5-day hours. So, from 40, say, down to 32. Mm-hmm. Provided, and this is the key point, provided we get 100% productivity. So we're still getting the same level of productivity. So, that gives the lie to the people who say, if I do a 4-day week, I'm going to have to recruit a whole pile more people in order to deliver it. That's not the thesis. And we have run these pilot programs or worked with companies, across the world in, everything from manufacturing, agriculture, logistics, health, even the police department in the city of Golden have gone on to a 4-day week. Have a look at their statistics. They've all improved. South Cambridgeshire Council in the UK did it against huge opposition from the then Conservative government and ended up, I think they had 17 criteria. 15 of them improved. The other 2 stayed the same, but those 2 are still better than the national average. Yet they are pilloried in some of the press for these people not working as hard. The thesis is work smarter, not longer. It is empowering people to do things in a better way. And the key part too of this is most of the inhibitors to performance, individual performance, aren't the sort of things that get up to a McKinsey review. It can be the interruptions that you're getting. It can be the fact that at lunchtime, your colleague is doing personal calls, eating something that's highly aromatic next to you when you're trying to focus on something else. Yeah. Or you're tired, you make mistakes, or there's lots and lots of bits and pieces which are the foibles of individuals, not a number that comes off a spreadsheet. And so what we're doing is recognizing that and saying what we might need to do may be different from human to human, but the goal is the same. And the other thing that the 100-80-100 plays to is that is applicable whether you are working 5 days, 4 days, 3 days, or 2 days a week, or even 1 day. It is about saying, if you can do the job in less hours, that's fine, provided the productivity remains the same. So that formula means that somebody who's on 4 days a week can either take less time to do their 4 days, or guess what? You should pay them more. Because if they deliver more than a 5-day output in 4 days, why aren't you paying them more? And this is very pertinent for returning mothers, often who would come back and negotiate a 4-day week contract on 80% pay and then deliver a full week's work. I mean, it's outrageous that they're not being paid the same. So when you look at this, you can see it. That is one driver. The other thing is you take the time off that's important to you. Now, that can be a half day, 2 half days, could be a day. Working parents, again, 5 days a week, compressed hours, take the kids to school, pick them up. That's the incentive here. I give you the time that's valuable to you, and that incentive you then apply to changing what you do to achieve the common goal.
So that segues nicely, Andrew. By the way, who doesn't like a 3-day-old tuna sandwich beside them? Come on. But I digress. It segues to the inhibitors or the naysayers, right? The leaders or organizations, senior leaders, the ELT, the SLTs. Like, why are they not seeing the light of what you, Perpetual Guardian, 4-day week, et cetera, have initiated and proven? So, I've heard, for example, in my stratagem world that, we'll just make them work 10 hours over each day of the 4 days. So it's still 40 hours because there's no way they can compress their productivity into 32 hours. We're going to, as you say, we're going to have to go hire, another 1/5 of a person. So that means for every 5 people, we now need 6. So you've probably come across a gazillion different leadership inhibitors. Tell me a bit more about that and sort of steps to overcome those.
Well, I think the challenge is that we're all conditioned, right?
Yeah.
I'm of a certain age. I commenced my career in the City of London. where a badge of honor was, to go home or sleep under the desk for a couple of hours, and you worked these incredible hours.
Keep calm and carry on, Andrew.
Yeah, that's right. I had two people had nervous breakdowns in front of me before I was 26. It was a brutal environment, but it's very hard to shake that. Right? It's very hard to. You've been totally driven all your life as a leader, that working longer, working harder, sacrificing almost everything on the pyre of getting up the greasy pole, that actually was saying you shouldn't have done that. that's actually not the pathway. Now that's a hell of an ask for a bunch of people initially to actually change that particular step. I think the second is that because we're not measuring things properly, because we don't really have rethought measurement of output, and time is that, it's very easy to just default to that point. If I reduce the time, I will need more people. Now, the people who've picked this up generally are people like myself who own their own businesses. So if this had gone wrong, I mean, yes, I have private capital investors, but if this had gone wrong, it was my back pocket that got hit. I could take risk.
Right.
But if you are, you're CEO of a public company, or, a business of which you are just an employee yourself, this is a hell of a step to take, to go to your board, to go to the principal shareholders and say, we're going to do this. Now, that's partly why we've continued to run the pilots for the last 5 years. Whether we will run a few more this year, but it's getting to the point the results are boring because every result is the same. The productivity goes up, turnover goes down, sick days half, and so all of this stuff, the good stuff is there. It's available for you to see. And there are now also enough companies in lots of different sectors doing it. So it's a different argument now. But up to now, I think people have said, it's too scary to do this. Why would I do it? Now this has become mainstream. I think senior executives are having to think more than that, because we're being, there is a shortage of good talent. I mean, it was very clear just after the pandemic, especially in the United States, that actually a method to attract and retain the best quality talent was by doing something like this. So suddenly people have been forced to rethink. So, the biggest barriers, I think, are preconceptions, bad measurement, and just an innate sense of short-termism and caution. Actually, you know what? I've got 3 years before I'm out of here. I don't need to make this call. I'll let my successor make the call. I'll keep it nice and safe, and I'll retire in 3 years, and my stock options are fine. And I hate to be that cynical, but it's probably that's the case. And what we've got to do is point out things. There's a piece of research out of Oxford University that says if you look at the happiness levels in your organization, there is a strong correlation between outperformance on the S&P 500 as a stock and having happy staff. Again, who'd have thought healthier, happier, more engaged staff would be more productive, more creative, and give a better customer experience? I mean, who'd have thought?
I detect a scent of cynicism, Andrew, but I've liked you for a long time.
Yeah, but you see the problem, Dan. I mean, that's the problem. Everything we're talking about is difficult to measure. A number is easy to measure. Time is easy to measure. This requires a little bit of thinking. The other thing it requires, and this is also a big barrier, we are where we are because we think that we've got answers to big questions, or maybe we have, maybe we're more creative, maybe we can do that. And a leader therefore says, actually, I know the answer to make my company more productive. Whereas the 4-day week movement says, actually, you don't. It's down at the grassroots. If you can harness the grassroots, if you can basically say, look, I'm going to let you guys find this way, that's not something that we're geared up to do. Right? So that's another problem. And the final one is we think that everybody thinks like us. And I have this battle all the time where I will be sitting with a group of chief executives, ends up the conversation turns to the 4-day week. And people go, but, we've got to work hard. They all, people need to work hard. They want to get up. They want to climb the ladder. 90% of the people in your organization have no desire to be a senior leader. They want to have a nice life, don't want the stress, want to bring up their kids, want to have a nice holiday. That's what they want to do. But we assume that everybody in the organization is motivated the same way as we are. Money talks. Now, what the research shows is, in fact, it doesn't. The time is valued more than the money. So what I do is I build a system that presupposes the only way I can motivate you is give you more money, when actually the evidence suggests the way I should motivate you is give you more time. Now, that's just turned 100 years of modern leadership theory and pay on its head and dropped it on the floor, right?
With a big thud.
With a big thud. Because we've assumed that the thing that motivates, it helps, but we've assumed that that's the main motivator, and it just isn't.
So good. I have a penultimate question and then a final one. Are there any differences, Andrew, and if there are, please help me understand them, and listeners and viewers, between certain, I guess, sectors? And when I say sector, what I'm really narrowing in on is public sector / government versus corporate. And if there's a corporate difference between, let's say, an SMB and enterprise and not-for-profit, do you see genuine difference of thinking, or is this a panoptic, systemic, everyone's either in or out, and we've got to get the people who are out convinced that this is actually a thing for the eudaimonia-seeking people out there in the world?
That's a tricky one, because it is very clear that motivations are different sometimes between public and private. And also, I think the way we measure attract is different between public and private. So the theory is it's the same. Mm-hmm. The practice is that actually, in some instances, there are stages that you've got to do before you can do it. So I would argue that there are certain, probably more state sectors, that actually have to do a journey towards proper measurement of productivity and determining productivity levels before they can go on to the next stage. Whereas most business has got the market disciplines of paying the bills every month, that they therefore have got a handle, may not be brilliant, on productivity and output. And so the problem is that the drivers are different. For this to work, both sides have to get a benefit out of it. So in business, it's quite easy. I, as a business leader, a shareholder, a board member, I benefit because I end up with a company that delivers the same and probably attracts and retains better people. In the public service, actually, I don't care. And that's a bit harsh, but I don't care in the context that my organization will remain regardless of how effective it is.
Right.
You see my point? It's quite a subtle point. That's not to say that they don't want to deliver. The sanction for failure is not the same. In private enterprise, the sanction for failure is you go bust.
Yeah.
In the public sector, the sanction for failure is I'll stick my hand out and somebody in the government gives me more cash. Now, that is an interesting difference in terms of motivation and how you change it. So quite often we see public sector unions, and we've seen it, say, in the UK recently, coming out and saying, we want a 4-day week. But the concept of discussing that link to productivity isn't there. In the private sector, this is very clear. This is productivity. We are unashamedly productivity driven. It is about improving productivity by creating a better work-life balance. Now, that is actually inverted in the public sector. It is work-life balance, and there is no debate on the productivity. So that's quite hard. That's where things like City of Golden, a few other, Iceland has done it, and also South Cambridgeshire and others. That's where that's interesting, because what they're then saying is actually we can demonstrate those productivity improvements, and actually they made the discipline of managing those. It's not usually what happens, sadly.
Listen, I feel like we're only skimming the surface, but as Henry Ford version 2.0 / the OG original gangster of the 4-day work week, my hat is tipped to you. As I say, I've been enthralled with what you've been doing for, getting close to a decade now. You're a prescient thought leader who really has his finger on the pulse of what eudaimonia should be in a work-life integrated way. Thank you. Hat tip to you, sir. And there's so many ways to find you, but where is the best way to find you and more about what you're up to these days?
Well, obviously, the 4-day week website has all the things on 4-day week. Me personally, we have a Barnes Lockhart, my partner Charlotte Lockhart, a Barnes Lockhart website which sort of covers the sort of stuff that we're doing personally, and we're trying to get our own balance right. I mean, the one outcome of the 4-day week is it completely stuffed our work-life balance up, because we've literally spent the last 5, 6, 7 years spending far too much time talking about it, usually actually at appalling hours of the night, when people phone us up from around the world. But this is now in 120 countries worldwide. We've had discussions, presentations, or we've worked with people. And I think at the heart of this, you go, and I think this is what keeps us going, because you don't get many chances to change the world. And that wasn't where we started. But, we look at what's happening now with the debates going on in business, in government. We look at the impacts, environmental, social, that drop off the back of this. And you go, actually, if that's our legacy, that's not bad. So, you don't get many chances to change the world. This one happens to be ours.
Well, it's a big one. It's a needed one. It's a necessary one. And it's one I think that's just going to continue to fuel and propel people to find and realize that state of eudaimonia. Happiness is not a gun, but it's an Andrew Barnes. How is that?
Oh, thank you for saying so.
Oh, it's just been a delight. Folks, it's Andrew Barnes. He's the co-founder of the 4-day week global, amongst many other things, of course, as well. An officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit, rightly deserved. Andrew Barnes, thank you for this time today.